everyone, I'm your host, Emily Anna Bachan, and we're back with the Mind Matters show of WESN Content Capital as we discuss engaging topics surrounding mental health and conflict resolution. Today's episode, I welcome our guest, Ms. Camille Quamina, who is a clinical psychologist. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you very much for having me.
So this week, we kick off on the topic of substance abuse and addiction. In this episode, we will learn about prevention methods and recovery processes and much more. So don't go anywhere and don't change the channel, as you will be missing out on a great opportunity where you can learn about substance abuse and prevention of the addiction. Hashtag substance abuse, hashtag addiction. So let's get right into it. So what are the most common psychological factors that lead to substance abuse?
There are a couple that can contribute to it. The interesting thing to note about substance abuse is we're in the realm of coping. So somebody is trying to cope with something.
Yeah.
So if we're looking at psychological factors, we're looking then at environmental stressors. So things that could be happening at home,
Right.
things that could be happening at work that can be stressful. We're also looking at maybe societal stressors sometimes, as well as the individual psychiatric status or even psychological status. So what is that person struggling with that could also make them, lean more on coping through substances. I think
Right.
important thing to mention too, I think, is genetics, because that has a certain psychological component also. And there are two particularly addictive disorders, nicotine and alcohol, that research has found genetic links for. So sometimes just genes can create a wiring that makes
Right. Where they're just more susceptible in doing it. Yeah.
Exactly. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
So how do you differentiate between substance use and then the abuse and then the addiction itself?
Right. I mean, just the way that you've structured it, I think, is a really good example of the progress or the process almost. Substance use is really using a substance.
Right.
Sometimes you may have to use opioids once prescribed by a doctor. Things like morphine, painkillers, those can be prescribed when you're using a substance ultimately.
And it's for actual need and purpose.
Exactly. Abuse comes in when we're using it and not for the purpose intended.
Right.
So when we start to use it and we're overusing it and we're not using it for the purpose intended, as well as using illegal substances too, fall in the substance abuse category.
Right.
Going on into addiction is where it's sort of a chronic problem over time, where you are having difficulty to control your compulsion to do or to engage in the substance. So things like, trying to cope with a situation ultimately.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I lost my train.
That's okay. That's all right.
What was the question?
It's really understanding, how do you differentiate between substance use, abuse, and addiction?
Right. So substance use is really just the use of a substance. So for example, some persons may need to use morphine. They may need to use opioids as prescribed by a doctor. That's a person that's using a substance that's under, guidance, professional guidance. Substance abuse is when you're using those substances not for the purpose that they were intended. So also engaging in illegal substance use falls in the substance abuse category. Addiction is that more chronic problem really, where over a longer period of time you have compulsion issues. So you feel as though
there's a need
to
constantly intake this.
Even though you're aware of the damage that it's doing, or sometimes even the financial losses, productivity losses, losses in work, and you're unable to implement that impulse control in order to stop. That's when we're kind of in that realm of it being addictive.
Right. So what role does trauma actually play in development of addiction?
Yeah. I mean, trauma plays a significant role. Trauma, I think it's important to understand what trauma is first. And what trauma is almost like first consider yourself having two bodies, a physical body and an emotional body.
Right, okay.
And trauma is really almost a jolt to the emotional body.
Yeah.
So sometimes we can get a jolt to the physical body, like you take a roller coaster ride, for example, and you're a little shaken up when you get off, you're a little unsteady on the feet. Same thing can happen to the emotional body. And when we're talking about substance use or abuse rather than addiction, we're in the realm of trying to cope with something. We're trying hard to emotionally regulate, and we're using unhealthy mechanisms emotionally.
As like a distraction. So we're trying to like fool the body and the mind technically.
Using unhealthy measures basically. And so trauma is this intense jolt to the system that requires an even greater emotional regulation. So it can play a really significant role in terms of the emotion that it puts a person under, the stress it puts a person under, that requires them to cope. Also, I think sometimes it's important to mention too that when you're under trauma for a prolonged period, that can even affect pregnancy health, which can affect genes in the womb. So if you have somebody, for example, who has to work Saturday to Saturday, they're standing on their feet the whole time and they're pregnant, and that in itself is a little traumatic and can really affect what's happening in the womb also.
Wow. So as you're a clinical psychologist, what tools or methods do you use, if you've ever used with any clients, to assess the substance use disorders itself?
I use two main types of tools. One is me sort of, the main thing to figure out if we're in the realm of abuse or addiction even is to get information. And so my primary tools are information gathering tools. So one is more standardized questionnaires. So these are questionnaires that have been developed through, years of research, and we know that they measure what they're seeking to measure, which is alcohol use. So they'll ask you questions like, do you have a difficult time stopping? How often do you, engage in substance, not just necessarily alcohol?
Just to understand the severity of it.
And so those are, standardized questions that have been proven, questionnaires that have been proven through research to be valid, reliable. So I can use those, and, a person fills out that standardized questionnaire, they get a score, and, we know.
Then you know how to treat
with it. Based on the score, how intense it is. And sometimes I just gauge it off of actually speaking to a person and talking to them. And sometimes persons can be very forthcoming and honest about what their situation is. So
so how does the, like if it's occurring where, sometimes they have a relapse. So like they're coming into a place where, I was using, let's say, alcohol, for instance, and I've been drinking, and, you just continue to do it for about a year or two. You go to your therapy, you get diagnosed, you get a little treatment, and then for some reason you tend to relapse. How does a person deal with that? And as a clinical psychologist, what are some tools or measures that you do to actually deal with a client like that?
I think relapse is more of a difficult process for the client themselves and usually their family and friends who don't necessarily have a better understanding of what's going on. But in terms of my process, or in my expectation of what that recovery process will look like, recovery from any addiction or substance abuse, I expect that there will be a relapse. It's almost a part of the recovery process. Because when we're dealing with substance abuse or even addiction, something that happens when you're doing this for a very long period of time is the brain gets rewired. So you now have almost, we usually feel good, for example, when we experience or we have dopamine in our brain. When you're using a substance and that's making you feel good, you can interfere with that dopamine regulation, for example. And so cutting it cold turkey, or, even having a longer period of absenteeism from doing the substances, there's still an expectation that you can relapse because there's been this brain rewiring, and so we expect it. The important thing is how you manage that relapse. How are you there for yourself in a different way than you usually are when you feel emotionally dysregulated, or you feel like you're experiencing tough feelings, or it gets very tough ultimately. So to me, the important thing to focus on is not so much, am I going to relapse? But if I do, because it's an expected part of the process, that I have the tools that I need to make it through in an easier way.
Okay, so I know we're talking a lot about the recovery process
Yeah.
for someone who has relapsed and whatnot, but in this phase itself, what are some of the common challenges that they actually face in the sense of, okay, they have accessibility to the drug or the alcohol and stuff like that. What actual challenge you think they would actually be facing in that moment, and how are they going to like overcome it?
Okay, you mean like if it's right there in front of them?
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
So really, it's a process of building skills in order
Yeah.
to be able to manage, because that need to consume the alcohol comes about from some sort of emotion or something that's happening.
Right. So something is triggering it. So
Exactly.
they have to be able to identify.
Yes, exactly.
Okay, why am I feeling this way?
Yes.
Right.
So really, the skill building that we're talking about are things like trigger identification.
Right.
Being able to use other coping mechanisms to manage when I have been triggered and I'm feeling disrupted, so that I'm not drawn to
Right.
that, substance for coping, for example.
Right. Okay. So, are there any early warning signs
Yeah.
for persons that, tend to use these unhealthy coping mechanisms, or I should say the maladaptive behaviors?
Yes.
What are some warning signs that parents and teachers should look out for, especially for the youths? Because we know nowadays we're kind of rum nation in Trinidad, where
Yes.
people just drink away their problems.
Yeah.
What are some warning signs?
I think that's a really good point, which is that we're in a culture where, for example, drinking is encouraged.
Yeah.
Sometimes after a carnival fight, you can smell the alcohol in the air.
Yeah.
So that in itself is a culture
crazy.
where it's
Yeah.
very, it's sort of in your face. So important thing, especially for parents and caregivers, to make sure you're aware of what your children are exposed to.
Right.
Some important signs that you can look forward to, because remember, when we abusing substances, we're trying to cope. So you can look for psychological indicators that there may be some psychological distress, which would
Right.
indicate the need to cope coming
Yeah.
up. So
Yeah.
things like mood swings, things like with teenagers, for example, they can end up getting a little irresponsible. So you find the things they're supposed to do, they're not doing, the schoolwork is spoiling. So those are all signs of psychological distress, which could indicate the possibility of coping using a substance. Genes, I think, are important to pay attention to. So if there's a family history of some sort of substance
Right.
abuse,
Alcoholism
yes,
and-
there may be a chance. So you want to put things in place like open conversation with children and teenagers that is age appropriate.
Of course, yeah.
About the dangers of substance use.
Right. So how does social stigma actually affect people that struggle with addiction?
Yeah. I think you hit the nail on the head with that one, which,
Yeah.
for example, around culture and violence, you can actually feel pressured to not want to drink or to go out and have water or to not want to go to a party. So there is that pressure on that one hand to participate, even if you don't. And then, we do an interesting thing in society where when somebody becomes addicted to a drug, we shame them.
Yeah.
There's this stigma that there's something wrong with you, you're weak, why can't you get it together, you don't care about it. But there's so much more that goes into addiction than just that basic surface level.
It's not on the surface, so much behind the iceberg itself that is factoring into why they're choosing this unhealthy mechanism.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so really, if we could work on our compassion as a society to encourage persons to want to do better for themselves when they found themselves coping with something that rewires the brain and then you can't stop,
Yeah.
So I think there's also that aspect of the stigma from society that needs to be kind of, explored and addressed.
Right. So what changes would you like to see as a clinical psychologist in society in handling addiction, recovery, and just substance abuse on the whole?
Yeah. I mean, I wish, if I had a wish list, I wish we would be more in schools.
Yeah.
Because I do find, in my private practice, I see a lot of teenagers who don't necessarily understand the dangers of drinking. So it's just a cool thing. It's like I had a drink at home.
Yeah, because everybody doing it. We have to fit in, peer pressure.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I've had cases of them, doing it in groups amongst themselves because it's such a cool thing.
Right.
So I think being, aware of the dangers of substance use and subsequent abuse and, how it can really negatively impact your projected development, I think is important. I wish we had more places
Yeah.
where persons who are addicted to drugs can get that holistic
Like AA,
treatment.
Alcoholic
Yeah,
Anonymous.
or rather maybe more of a living place that,
Yeah.
you know, is
Yeah.
a little bit more dignified
Right.
for persons to enter into and be treated with a level of respect and
Because they're
compassion.
human beings at the end of the
Who's
day.
just struggling.
Yeah,
to
and they
cope.
just need help. Yeah, they just need that extra help and support.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yes, exactly.
Okay, so just to get a little bit of your professional insight, what drew you to work in the field of understanding substance abuse and addiction and stuff like that as a psychologist?
Yeah. I mean, being a clinical psychologist, I think, you know, sometimes people say, especially with singers, they say, you know, well, how did you decide to be a singer?
Yeah.
They say, it's something I've been doing all my life.
Yeah.
As cliche as that sounds,
Yeah.
I kind of feel like I've always been into psychology, always reading it, even before I knew it was a thing you could get a degree for. So always kind of interested in that realm. And what particularly interests me in which substance abuse falls in that category is how difficult it can be for a person to cope with something that feels so insurmountable, and you're on the outside looking on and saying, no, I promise you it's not.
Yeah.
So I really enjoy that kind of work, and substance abuse falls in that category because it's just somebody fundamentally having a very hard time coping, putting it mildly, and needing that sort of help to be able to be their best self.
Yeah, yeah, and it's actually like very correlated, you would think, with suicide and self-harm as well.
Yes.
Where persons want to essentially end their life.
Yes.
Can you give us some thoughts on that?
Yeah.
If there's a correlation.
I think it's important to understand when you're talking about things like suicide again, with the realm of coping, and it just feels like so much that I think the only solution is to take me out. So substance abuse is a really good example of that higher level difficulty of coping, which also falls in that range of, you know, suicidal attempts or even successful suicides. And I also think a large part of when you have a substance abuse disorder, a substance use disorder, really links to some type of other comorbid psychological something happening, usually. So you can actually have, when we say comorbid, I mean occurring together. And we can also have, you know, usually anxiety or depression comorbid with substance abuse. So it does make the, you know, difficulty of trying to treat an unhealthy way of coping, which is going to cause withdrawal and problems within itself, which is being used as something to cope. Something else. So now you have a double whammy of trying to cope, which can increase that risk of feeling like I can't cope. Which puts us in possible, you know, suicidal realm that we want to be mindful of.
So any final thoughts about substance abuse and addiction that you'd like to share with our viewers?
Yes. I think it's very important to not shame yourself if you're in a situation right now where you are having a hard time breaking a compulsion, or if you find yourself using a substance for something other than its intended purpose. Very treatable. Tons of research has gone into it. There's no need to shame yourself, and there's no need to take on shame from society. Ignore it. And just enroll yourself in programs, therapy with a clinical psychologist, where you're able to get that individual sort of specific treatment.
Tailored to you.
Exactly. You know, so forget the shame. Would be my advice.
Okay, that's wonderful for our viewers. So I want to share two rhetorical questions to our viewers that are looking on. Can we truly break the cycle of addiction if we continue to treat it as a moral failure instead of a health issue? Let's probably think about it in a different lens. And of course, how many cries for help must go unheard before we realize that addiction is a symptom of a deeper pain and not just bad choices? People are going through a lot of things in their daily lives that we don't know about. And some people, they wear a smile and they may be, you know, dealing with their demons. So think about that. And of course, if you know anybody that is struggling with substance abuse or addiction, these are some things that you can think about in order to have compassion for them. I want to share a couple self-help tips for this week, where we also talked about with the clinical psychologist, where you acknowledge the problem without shame. Acknowledge. The first step is recognizing that you are struggling. That's the first thing. That is a sign of strength when you could actually identify that, hey, something is wrong, and that, you know, I'm abusing this drug or alcohol or whatever, and it's not a sign of weakness. Accepting the need for loved ones and, you know, having that open space will help you to find ways to recover. The second thing is to build a supportive system. Of course, surround yourself with people that will support your healing journey, which could be family, friends. You know your circle, you know your people that you would go to for this recovery. And of course, you can always seek professional help if it is, you know, you are struggling and you're not getting the support that you need. You can go and find yourself in groups that are tailored to you for whatever issue is at hand with the substance abuse and addiction. And the third thing, identify your triggers. Of course, that's very important. We have to be able to regulate our emotions and understand, why am I feeling to use this drug or drink, you know, in a way that is not good for you. And the fourth thing, create healthy daily habits. Create routines that would help with your recovery process. If it is you have been a person that has been struggling with addiction of alcohol or drugs. And the last but not least, celebrate your small wins and your victories. Recovery is a journey. It's not going to fix itself like that. Right? It's not a straight line. You're going to have bumps and curves. You might have relapses, but that's okay. That's just part of the journey of recovery. And of course, we have some resources to share, especially for the youths. There's Young Caribbean Minds. That is a mental health hub where you can find numerous ways to cope. And there's the workbooks, and we also have the directory, which has numerous mental health services as well tailored for you. There's the Ministry of Health Mental Health Services. There's findcareTT.com, which have many organizations, NGOs that can help and be of assistance. For example, there's TTAP, the Trinidad and Tobago Association of Psychologists, and there are a number of them that you can contact for whatever issues that you are facing. And a couple hotlines, we have Lifeline and Childline TT, where it is designed to support your mental health and your well-being across Trinidad and Tobago. And that brings us to the end of another powerful episode. This was our final episode of the Mind Matters show of WESN Content Capital. Thank you so much for watching and being a part of our community and our important conversations. Remember that your mind matters, your voice matters, and you are never alone on this journey. Until another time, I'm your host, Emily Anna Bachan. Take care and be kind to your mind as always. #Mental Health Matters. Bye.